I think the other guy. We are going to Puebla tomorrow.
Listo,
Welcome everyone back. I hope you had some rest. Welcome Ariana or whoever is also on the YouTube channel. So we're gonna start with Miriam Peña's presentation, and I'm gonna shortly introduce you, and then you can just start. So Miriam Peña is a specialist in digital humanities and literary studies, with particular interest in the development of models for enriching publishing and digital scholarship for the training of human resources in the digital humanities. Miriam Peña works in the research project Biblioteca Mexicana y Humanidades Digitales Aplicadas, where she develops protocols for digital preservation through enriched publishing and object remediation. She's coordinator of the Digital Heritage Program of the IIB and professor of the School of Librarianship of the Faculty of Philosophy, where she teaches the subject of digital libraries and archives. She is also a professor of the Master in Communication and Digital Humanities at the Universidad del Claustro de Sor Juana. She's a member of the Digital Humanities Network since 2013. She has participated in collaborative research projects such as Obras Maestras de la Bibliografía Mexicana, hacia la construcción del modelo para ediciones críticas digitales, intercambios oceánicos, trazando redes de información global en repositorios de periódicos históricos, Biblioteca Digital del Pensamiento Nuevo Hispano, and Elabora HD, among others. She has participated in national and international conferences on digital humanities. So welcome, Miriam.
Well, thank you. Just no. How do you make this ocultar here? Okay, well, first, thank you for the invitation. As I said before, bear with me. It's been a while since I've given a talk in English, so I'll do my best. So the idea of what I've been trying to do in the last 10 years, it's working with digital humanities. I'm actually from the literature background, and then just suddenly happened that I was working with digital humanities. It was not a choice, it was my destiny. So what I'm going to be talking about today, it's, even though it's been about 50 years in digital humanities have been around, there is not one definition. So we are going to try to go towards that, maybe a little consensus, given the spectrum of this conference, of this workshop, we are going to have to go through how digital humanists will define technology and the positions between users and creators of technology. Since this talk is aimed to talk about peripheries and their practices, and finally, I'm gonna talk a little bit about a project that's going on in Latin America specifically, and the goals that we are trying to achieve in the following, if we are able to do it. So digital humanities has been around for about half a century, a little bit more. However, there is no one single definition. There are terms that appear again and again within different subjects and backgrounds, and it doesn't matter if you are working with drama or history, these topics come again and again. Distant reading, automated analysis, virtuality, computer technologies, digital objects, digital citizenship, digital culture. However, it's a mix between processes, between methodologies and concepts, and pretty much they are interchangeable. You can use digital citizenship just to talk about a term, but also to describe a person or a population. So it's a little, it's not as stuck in stone as history or literature. So it's very fluctuating between meanings, and not only the meanings, but the way we are using it, how we are approaching to this. So coming from definitions, it's about 10 years ago, there were no definitions in Spanish. We continue working with the Global North definitions. This is one of them. Matthew Kirschenbaum, it's an old definition, it's 10 years old. So the approach he's giving to this, to digital humanities, to try to define digital humanities, it has to be, it's related to research groups. This idea that three friends start working together and then they realize that they are super cool and they like computers and they also read poems. So then it grew from that, and yeah, in some parts it's true. That's how it works. In some parts, it has way more founding infrastructure and especially administrative commitments. So given that you have an academia that supports what you are doing and that encourages to continue doing it. Another definition is that Digital Humanities continue looking for the meanings of the problems of the humanities. But we are embedded in the age of information and linked information networks. So we are forced to create communities of practice in order to start giving answers to these questions of what does it mean to be human. We haven't given it an answer yet. So this posture, the Bardic posture, is a little bit like technology becomes a means to an end. It's given, you have to use it, you have to, because it makes your work easier, but also because you cannot do it without the use of technology. And by technology, I mean computer technology. We are not going rather than that. But also the idea that is digital humanities are global, are trans-historical, and also transmedia. You have to go to use a transmedia approach in order to create knowledge and get a construction of meaning. So it's interesting that the concept of community comes again and again. The idea of also Span's quote in Macari. It's a concept of community strongly related to basic reality of research humanities, collaborative research, interdisciplinary research, and this is good because this quote is interesting. It's Spanish translated to English translated to Spanish, then translated again to English. So it's not a perfect quote, but it is a good exercise to see what happens with the Google Translate. So the Spans start talking about the dissonant voices emerging, and that's almost 8 years ago, 10 years ago. This dissonant voices is a little bit what is happening right now with the periphery in digital humanities. So back then in 2014, maybe the dissonant voices were 2 or 3. Now it's becoming a group. However, in order to be able to work and to produce and get and create associations, for example, we reach a consensus that, well, everything, the globalization of information, give all of us access to cultural production and pretty much in real time. So that it's a lot of information in order to manage it, to handle it. So we need tools to help us reach that level of scholarship that we need in order to produce research. So that's where the humanities come. Like it's the use of technology, but we are still answering the humanist questions. So how we answer that? Well, developing methods, methodologies, processes, protocols of study, in order to navigate of this sea of information that it's widely available. And also in most of the cases, it's not stable, changes through time. So where do we see technology then? Well, it is impossible to conceive the work of the digital humanist without the use of computational tools. They're simple. If you don't use computational tools, then you are a humanist, not a digital humanist, in some way. So that leads to the development or adaptation. Usually is more frequent that we adapt existing technologies made for other disciplines to carry out our work. So there are very few examples of software that's specifically developed for humanities. Pretty much you use software that's developed for business usually, or communication, journalism, and you adapt that to do digital, well, humanities studies. However, there is there is still one group that claims that the main problems that we face as digital humanists is not the technological problem. It's actually a social problem, still a social problem. So we foster participation, collaborative projects, developing preservation and preservation practices and preservation methodologies, and encourage the institution to work with us and to give us some respect and recognition, and also promoting new ways of thinking about how the academic work that we are doing, it's worth being, that's continued to be done. I'm not sure that I don't really agree with this quote, because from another point of view, the vision of technology as just a minuscule part of the problem can only be considered a minor part of the problem when you are part of the group that creates the technology. So if you're not a creator of the technology, you're just a user of the technology. So it's important to make a difference between the creators, as intellectual actors, people who are developers, and then the producers and replicators. Because 80% of technology, it's not done in the North Global, it's done in the South Global. Even the raw materials are created below the equator line. So the Global South, it's not a region that is considered to be creative. It's replicators or gatherers of natural resources in order to create the computers, or just manufacturers. So there is no a creative component that's recognized with this below that line. So the origin of the creative genius, it's not a question. It's taken for granted. Like the North creates, the South reproduces. So then this becomes a guarantee where all this that are apart, that are far from the sphere of creation, becomes just users. Maybe advanced users, but users still. So the user's posture is inevitably transformed, because by not being a creator of technology, we have to adapt the use of the technology existed that is given to us. So there's a non-native technologies. At least I don't know any native technologies that can accomplish what we're doing. So can I navigate through that and start using and creating different methodologies in order to feel a little bit more appropriation about the use of the technologies, even though these processes and even the results that you produce maintain a structure that replicates the global thinking. We continue, even we can start talking about the kiput in Peru, in Incan culture. Yeah, we don't know what that means. So we are trying to explain it. So in that way, the peripheries remain in a permanent state of translation. Translate from the native to the culture that after colonization, the culture that remains, and then translate from the colonized to the rest of the world. So it's a permanent state of translation, and something always gets lost in translation. That's a fact. So about the peripheries, well, I added a quote from the Alliance of Digital Humanities Organization. That's a global organization that we are part of, the IDHO. And the definition they use, it's also a definition very, very general. It's an umbrella organization, first of all, whose goals are to promote and support digital research and teaching across arts and humanities disciplines. Drawing together, humanists engage in digital and computer-assisted research, teaching, creation, dissemination, and beyond, in all areas reflected by its diverse membership. ADHF supports initiative for publications, presentation, collaboration, and training, and recognizes and supports excellence in these endeavors, and acts as a community-based, consultative, and advisory force. So there is umbrella organization, this idea that everybody belongs because it's an umbrella, and because we don't have a one definition, then we will be part of that. Diverse membership, yes, there are a lot of memberships. We have Taiwanese Association, the Japanese Association, the Latin Americans, the Africans, but we will have to see how diverse that actually is. And also, well, again, community-based, community, it comes again and again. So the only topic that doesn't appear reflected in the definition that ADHO gives to describe themselves is globalization. How is that possible? Well, I mean, it's given for granted. If you have people in Africa and in Europe and in Latin America, then you're global. That's it. It also encourages a global thinking, which the non-global part of the periphery of the minimal aspects, the regional aspects became a little lost again. So how does the periphery enter in these kind of projects and association, and also in general in the digital humanities? Well, through the creation again of communities of practice, but aiming to a regional community of practice. So if you, well, that's our belief, that if you have a strong regional community of practice, then you are not so much, you're not going to be in the center of the ADHO, the global practices, but at least you are part of the periphery, not an outsider, which has a very strong difference to be that. So how does the periphery produce? Unfortunately, by conforming to established lines. If literature, distant reading. If you're working to history, then networks of movement of information. If you're working from the anthropology, then maybe timelines to create something. So, but that is not new. I mean, even before the digital humanities, how is philosophy produced in Latin America or outside Eurocentric knowledge? Yeah, it has to go through, it has to align to what is being done, because it's my belief that true innovation doesn't exist. Like something that's completely new, it's just not recognizable, so you tend to just drop it out. So what is the innovation? Well, in the sporadic incorporation of our discourses. And I mean sporadic incorporation because if for example, that goes with all this diversity that is given in the digital humanities atmosphere. So having a call for papers in French doesn't mean that if you are studying a very obscure Senegalese author that publishes in French, it's going to be included into the conference, for example. But it doesn't matter what you're writing for. If you are talking about Shakespeare, you're in. So that level of inclusion, it's sporadic. Maybe out of 800 papers that are received each year, maybe a little bit 50 are capable to include own discourses and own practices. So that's where LATAM and the DH, LATAM HD, got created. So first of all, LATAM and Digital Humanities is an initiative that seeks to become horizontal and open space, where different actors, projects, and events and activities aiming to digital humanities in Latin America. It is important to the horizontality that it's looking for, because then it will be another form of colonization if Argentina becomes the lead or Mexico becomes the lead. So the horizontality, it's important. It's kind of difficult to maintain because some areas produce more than others, but it's been a goal. Francisco can testify to that. So this is a kind of an old project. It was the first idea of LATAM HD was in the 2018 in the conference. That also was an interesting conference. Was the first time the ADHO came outside of Europe and North America, and the conference was held here in Mexico City. So it was like the center between, the South America and the global South and the global North, even though we have the gay parade, closing up elections, and football, and it was a World Cup at the same time of the conference. So not too much people in the conference room, but too much people looking the soccer on TV. So from that, it was a landing page that seeks to gather announcements, conference call for papers, but also to create a network of academics working in digital humanities with all Latin America. We are still using a distribution list in order to reach more people. And the idea is to, and it's happening even more and more, to create regional collaboration. So this community becomes a strong regional community in order to approach another bigger one, that's the global community. So there is a publication kind of idea, the Acta Académica, and also after that, there is already a journal in Spanish about digital humanities. This is the first journal that published digital humanities that is not in English, or French, or German, and Dutch. That's German and Dutch. Oh, not European, not. Well, no, Spanish is a European language. Well, Latin American produce. So the question was raised. We needed to have specific relations, and the postgraduate students are actually the best asset we have. You can move. It's easier for a postgraduate student doing a PhD in Argentina and coming back from Mexico to Colombia than from someone who has tenure, that it's very difficult to move. So, and establishing the publishing material, the journal has 6 numbers right now, 8 numbers out. So like 7 numbers out. Everything is done in Spanish, and sometimes some Portuguese are included. What was interesting is that from the 2018 meeting, these were the countries that participated in the Latin American meeting. So as you can see, there is not much in Latin America. Pretty much the ones that are always there: Mexico, Argentina, Chile, Colombia, and Peru was a surprise that was there actually, but we don't have, and it's not Puerto Rico, it's República Dominicana, Dominican Republic. The rest is well, US, Canada, Spain, France. So it, I don't know. I mean, you have Spain, but you have it's. I mean, while seeing this map, it's first of all, this is raw data, so we need to see actually if because it's my assumption that because there are Latin Americans all around the world, so maybe it's like somebody in the US actually is from Latin American background, etc. But that doesn't mean that necessarily are working towards Latin American problems. So I think the representation is this had to be a little bit clean to see actually who is from, doing studies from the region for the region. So we do have goals, and not everything is bad. First, the strength of the networks, the growth of the Latin American community, and also the dissemination of projects and works and calls for papers. That there has been an issue with conference like the annual conference of biannual conferences of the organizations. It's not as easy to move from Mexico to Buenos Aires. It's a 12-hour flight that it is to move from France to London. So that it's too much. So actually, with the only good thing that came with the COVID is that we were forced to use these kinds of technologies, and that I think it's been really helpful in order to be present in the conference in Argentina without having to spend 12 hours on a plane. So that's making that the collaborations, not only to the conferences, but also the projects are growing. And you have, well, you will see it later. If you are going to Puebla, you will see that it's only a 2-hour ride, but it's only a 2-hour ride for something that is really next door. So even the national networks are growing and are creating different routes and canals of communication. So it is, because everything is political, we are aiming to promote a geopolitical definition, or at least consensus of digital humanities and how we practice digital humanities, how it's different from the global north. Also because, as I said before, the being users of technology also doesn't mean that we have access to the most advanced technology. Like if we have, for example, some project done in Cuba, yeah, sometimes you don't have light. How are you expecting to have internet? Or so these are problems that are only questioned when you are far away from where the technology is produced or created. And those are questions that actually made us change the way we approach our objects of study, how we create, how we propose the new practices. So it is, yeah, it sounds like I'm whining, but it's not a complaint. It's just an extra challenge, because you had to try to adapt, but with certain limits and deficiencies. So, and that's why the project sustainability it's a problem as well. How long can you sustain a project to be available? And we also said, well, yesterday about the publishing, the digital publishing. Well, yeah, we have a DOI, but we need to use the same project to make a second edition, third edition, so it's never ending. And when you have an unfinished, this is a growing product actually, but it's considered unfinished in the academic terminology. So how are you gonna get a grant if you never finish the project? And the publication is changing continually. So the project sustainability is a little conflict as well. However, even though we have those goals, we are still the technology user versus the technology creator is a condition that's maintained. The discourses, the political, the theoretical, are still restructured in order to match the umbrella of the communities of practice. So we have to adapt. We're still adapting our discourses to that. And the knowledge creation is aligned also with those the already established discourses and lines of thought and research. And well, the innovation, the centralized voice, the alternative, and maybe in some cases native voices are still in translation. That's actually my main concern. We are keeping and maintaining ourselves translating again and again and again to different spectrums and different aspects of what we are working with. And that's it from me. Thank you very much. So I think we have time for questions.
Yeah, so questions? Yeah, Stefan?
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you very much for this talk, Miriam. I have a lot of questions. So I start with something which I would like better understand. So I understand the point that this regional organization in itself is a value. So, but on the other hand side, I ask myself, what are the specific conditions under which research here is working? So because what are for example in the European Union you have specific funding agencies on a European level where you can apply for, I really do not have any idea about, for example, the funding system for these different countries in Latin America. Are there similarities between these countries in itself, or is there any overarching activity? So is, for example, with regard to human there's these digital humanities. Are there aims that the national funding agencies are cooperating for offering grants and for people coming from different countries? So that's the first question. I have a lot of others, but I would like to start with
This one is very easy to answer. There is no Latin American Union, so it's national grants, but most of the grants encourages you to have research from different parts of the world. There are certain specific grants that are aimed to working with Argentina or Colombia. So, and those are federal grants. So it's quite easy to establish channels of communication, but there is no agency for Latin America. So we go each one to our national grants, and then we make the networks and invite researchers to be part of it.
But it's easy to cooperate, however.
Yeah, most of the universities through Latin America have some level of agreements that you just maybe not with mainly with public universities, because most of the education in Latin America is public. So we have a lot of exchanges within that. So it's already established. So it's really easy to get something. The difficult part is to get a grant, not to get the people working.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, I have Christine.
Yeah, I have, thank you so much. Really interesting to hear. I have two questions. One is, I'm curious of any sort of the example projects you're working on. So just getting to know more sort of some of the projects that are happening in Latin America. And the second question is sort of relating to this condition that you described, which is, I would sort of describe it also as sort of client-servant relation, where sometimes, as you describe it, you're sort of forced into a situation where to use software that is not sort of entirely designed for your situation. I think we're all familiar with this, having taught during the pandemic, we ended up with using business software for teaching, right? And so it happens all the time. So I think the problem sort of also exceeds the sort of global north, global south relation. It's a larger problem. So I'm wondering to what extent what you're doing relates to sort of other practices that seek to sort of address this problem. I'm thinking in particular of something like feminist practices, where you're sort of trying to reappropriate the tool, not just sort of using other tools, but also building communities around sort of the knowledge of maintaining and developing and hosting and building communities around this. Sort of, yeah, so two questions. One, the projects, the other one, sort of the relation to this sort of problem, which I think sort of exceeds the.
Well, I'll answer the second one first, because I'm opening the website so I can show you some of the projects that are going on. So yes, these practices are maybe 1 in 1,000 examples. So it's like there are some, but I mean, I in my position where I'm working from, it's they are examples I use to study and to teach, but I am not part of that. So there is something that. Okay, sorry, got distracted with that. So there are, and I think we need to incorporate some of this. For example, the feminist aspect. They have very interesting practices that are taking part of. So maybe we have to copy or adapt what they are doing towards our practices. I know there are some groups that are still working, that are starting to work with those. I am working with the digital preservation of all documents, so it's a little bit out of my scope. But yeah, we are considering because we kind of borrow not only the technology, but also the practices, and it helps me. Yeah, so I'm gonna take it and adapt it and use it to get what I'm trying to do. So this borrowing of technologies and this borrowing of methods and practices and processes, it's done all the time. So it depends pretty much what your goal is. If you take something from the sciences or the social sciences, or if you have some protocols established for even political science, that they have very strict protocols that are very useful to create a linear, a non-linear discourse talk. So that's happening all the time. The borrowing of knowledge from other traditions and other areas of expertise, and that's why we are always working in an interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary kind of way. So it's very rare the project that you have only philosophers or only people from history, or only, you always have a mix of a group of people working, and not only from the humanities, also from the social sciences that are and well, obviously the technical aspect, the computer scientists that are part of the projects as well. Which I think it's interesting, because the computer scientists are not only the tech guy who creates the algorithm, are part of the research problem. So you have to understand how they think, because they think quite different than a humanist, and they have to understand how we think, so we can create something together. So the creation of new tools that are specifically designed to tackle a problem is happening. I mean, Francisco showed you one yesterday. It's just that maybe it's a very specific tool for very specific problems. It's still the change or the jump to make that a little bit broader or bigger to tackle another problems. For the first question about the projects, well, I'm gonna show you here. So this is one of the landing site that's being used to showcase different projects, and this is about some letters. So from the digital library Bogota, Colombia, they are mapping the connections towards the correspondence and what's going on. There is also some work doing with arte sacro, like religious art, that's also being in order to study the Peruvian and Hispanic American Baroque, using as well, they are also using networks visualization to connect the schools of art that are going, and how the art modified from the original Baroque art to the Peruvian Latin art, Baroque art. This is there are like big projects, for example, with Casa Velasquez. That means talking about the literature. This one is good. Keywords to talk about literature written for women in Mexico. It's gonna take a little bit. So because this is the yeah, it usually happens when you're trying to showcase something. Well, we will update the link, I promise. So computer analysis, text analysis, also talking about peripheral literatures, and that the main, not only Latin American writers, but also the non-big names of Latin American literature. So it's not Octavio Paz, it's another writer. It's not Garcia Marquez. The less well, this visualization about research in philosophy. So if you want, I can share with you link, so you can. It's everything in Spanish, but it's quite.
By now you are Spanish speakers.
Yeah, you're almost native speakers. So yeah, it's a huge diversity of projects that's being done. So we have a lot to show. And me personally, I was working in this. The last project is it's about bibliography with text analysis, TEI, showcasing the first bibliography done in Spain, in Mexico. 1700s kind of books. So it's a critical edition based with TEI, with 3 different translations from Latin to Spanish to another researcher working at that. We're still getting some of the manuscripts because this collection is spread between Mexico, Austin, and Spain. We're still collecting the materials in order to finish the digitization of the documents, and then the rest of the work being done. So that's what we are doing, and this is what I've been doing for the last 2 years.
Okay. I have Ali.
Thanks very much. Thank you, William. I enjoyed very much your presentation. I have 2 theoretical questions, if I may. First, at some point you say, I really appreciate your presentation. That in your presentation is that you are very careful about claiming the capacity in this moment of academic institutions from post-colonies to really be fully in charge of their own development, right? And this is not obviously their fault. It's the really big bias about which we were talking yesterday. You mentioned earlier. I'm shortcutting what you said. How do we know what ink and digital humanities might look like? Well, we don't. We are positioned in a certain way from where the best that we can do is be critically aware of our bias, right? And I like that. And you say, of course, you say that something also always gets lost in translation. And I agree. But here's my question, because I think that's fine, right? Because I said, what we need to do is to be critically aware of our bias. Because especially from the digital humanities notion of knowledge as transmedial, as you adopt, learning is translation. All knowledge is translation, right? Meaning that in all knowledge is always positioned, it is always medially contextualized, right? So to know is to be able to know something, means to be able to perform a translation, right? Medial translation. And indeed, in that process, something gets lost, but also something new emerges. So I would say, would you agree that there's no problem that something gets lost as long as we are aware of that, right? I know I'm shortcutting. My second question is, what is periphery as a concept, as a theoretical concept? I'm familiar with some theories, especially say in my case, Yuri Lotman, that discuss cultural dynamics in terms of let's call it center-periphery dialectics. I'm not particularly a fan of that, but I want to know about your theoretical concept of periphery. Okay,
well, first, I agree. I mean, yeah, the translation, something is lost, but you gain something. We are all the time translating ourselves, and translating to ourselves to others and others to ourselves. So I do agree that I'm seeing translation as a problem because of the lack of awareness that we are being translated.
Yeah.
So if you know that you are being translated and you're translating, then fine, it's good. And at the periphery, I'm not going to. Maybe the definition I'm using. It's more like the Lotman you say one. However, I don't have a definition. It's like more of experience thing. Like I know I am in the periphery.
Right.
So it's more, and I know like the community I'm working with, we are in the periphery, but we are not outsiders. It's like this jump between, and I really don't know if we want to be the center.
Right.
So it's like, okay, we're in the periphery and we kind of like being here because also give us some flexibility and some latitude that we can do our own thing. And then we can exchange with you in the center. And
But I
then we
don't
can
think
exchange
simply-
with the people outside. So
Right,
for me, this periphery, like the perimeter we are in, it's a really good place to be, because you are not deep down that you have to be so rigid.
right,
So you can have this exchange between, maybe we can have talks with hackers,
right,
which when you don't want to get a hack, and we can have talks with the dean of some institution.
right.
It's more from an vantage point of view and more for experience, where I'm developing my practices.
I understand.
That's the periphery I'm talking about.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You kind of already answered my question of what you just said about periphery, because I was going to ask about like the identity of like Latin American digital humanities and its relation to like the dominant discourse of the dominant fields, but you kind of already said that.
Okay.
So
Thank you.
Then we have David.
Was one short question. But first of all, thanks. Also because at the beginning of the talk, you made a point that I think is pretty trivial, but for me it was quite interesting that you emphasized the concept of humanities so much. So and everyone, at least in my experience, correct me if I'm wrong, in Germany is talking so much about the digital. And the humanities become more a kind of institution. They have to legitimize their being while they are using digital technology. So what's the humanity part of humanities gets lost more and more. And I thought that in your talk somehow it has that level that the humanities have here a kind of certain impact that goes along with the digital technology. So I think in your talk, maybe I'm wrong, but there's a certain balance between the digital and the humanities, and this balance has to be here. It's not that like humanities using now digital tools and that becomes something interesting again. So that was very interesting for me. But then short question. What about the because and I'm also referring a bit to this kind of periphery position in the use or in the adaptation of software in this case. What about this concept like user experience? So, but because I'm asking this because the classical Western concept of the business background, but wouldn't it be a kind of I was just asking myself, wouldn't it be also a kind of question for the digital humanities that you do to create a kind of new idea or new concept of something like a user experience? So the idea is how to measure the loss in translation, or how to measure something what you gain in translation. You know, so because this user experience idea is a typical product-driven idea, but something that what you described is a completely different dynamic, and I thought maybe that's kind of idea.
It could be interesting to measure that what's happening. We have an experiment here a while ago with students, like the students that came into the first year of history. We gave them a quiz, like answer this. How do you use your cell phone? Where do you study? Do you use a computer, a laptop? And they knew a lot about computers. They knew a lot about, well, nobody knew what a desk computer was, which was interesting. But also they consider themselves advanced users, but they don't know that they are using just 10% of the capacity of their cell phone or the computer. So I think it's also like the trial and error of the user experience. And if you need to learn to use something, you are gonna do it. It's a lot of self autodidacta. How do you say that?
Self-taught.
Self-taught. That so I don't know, how can you measure self-taught to people? Maybe given some practice and they will solve this problem with what you need, or if you need to solve this problem, what would you do? Where would you go? Because pretty much everything is online now. You can find and you can learn anything you want, specifically in the technical aspect, which is the easiest part. What we are more oriented here is that, okay, at least if you're gonna use all of this, have a critical way of approaching what you're using. Why you're choosing to use a Microsoft Office instead of LibreOffice, why you're choosing to use Zoom instead of Jitsi. So things that it's like, it's not a bad part to be a user, but at least if you're being a user and not a creator, have a critical thought of why you are using this, what's going on. Well, yesterday we talked about open access. Yes, why? Because pretty much in at least in Latin America, pretty much all the publications are done in the national universities that are public funded. Why do you have to give your paper to Elsevier? Because you're paying again. So it's more in the training of the critical thinking than in the training of the technology. That's why I think there is this balance between digital humanities and the computer and the humanities. It's not just a technical part of the computational part. It's a good equilibrium, I think. I think we're achieving that at least. Thank you.
Stefan?
Yeah, I would like to follow this point to the founding really interesting because then this tension between user-oriented or also be a creator of something. There's which is the question of this and also which is by one of David. The point for me is when it is important or necessary really to come into the role of the creator. So as you put it in this question of these translations we face especially, and there are these dominant technology providers, and it's also for us as Europeans, America. So they are the dominant providers with Roger Thompson. We face similar problems somehow. However, the question is, what are the shortcomings, or what are the real problems created or coming out caused by this situation? So that there would be a need to come into a position being creator of such an infrastructure. So I would like to ask you directly whether you have your huge experience to deal with these questions, cases where you have an experience in mind where you thought, wow, in this case it would be really important to be a creator, not only.
I don't think I have faced that yet. But well, I think what we need is kind of a revolution between the creators and the users, because I think I think with Digital Humanities and pretty much all of us are quite comfortable using what we are given. So I haven't faced such a huge discomfort yet that I need to do something so radical different. So I think because the same, I mean, yeah, I'm in Latin America, but I'm in Mexico City, I'm not, so it is also a comfort zone. So right now I'm starting to do that. One of my students, she is working with a community in Oaxaca, and they are trying to create some digital identity for the town, because they are producers of some typical clothing that Zara and these labels are stealing the designs. So they are convinced that if they have a digital identity created, they will be able to at least stop these people from stealing the designs or pay them some royalties, something like that. And the problem is that the town doesn't have light. So they have like generators once in a while, but I can't remember the name of the town, but it's deep in the mountains. So they do have like, and they managed to have cell phones. So we are trying to do something, creating like a network of solar phones. Most of them have smartphones in order these phones connected be the network that will help to create because yeah, you have a website, but if you are not in contact and you answer to the buyers and sellers, then you just another website in the internet. So I don't know how we're going to solve this. But as soon as we have an answer, I will reach out to you guys and let you know what happened, because it's a very interesting problem. And it's also the idea that they need a digital identity in order to not be stolen of the work that they've been doing for hundreds of years. It's a challenge, but it's a very good challenge. We'll let you know what happened as soon as she finishes her master's and do the project. Thank you.
So, anyone else? Pablo?
Yeah, it's very interesting, Mariam. Thank you. It's more about curiosity about the organizational setup, right? Because I understand that there was the big Digital Humanities conference in 2018.
18.
But then there's the intention or the peripheral network of Latin American Digital Humanities. But I was wondering, like, how do you do that? Like, do you meet often? Do you have like certain governance model incorporated into that? That's one thing. And the other is you have challenges with infrastructure too, for example, right? Because unlike humanistic projects that maybe don't need a technical infrastructure, a technical expertise, maintenance, and that Digital Humanities does have to deal with that. So I was wondering also if you have been challenged by that and how have you resolved those issues?
Well, we are lucky that most of the people that's part of the Latin American Association, well, it's not actually a Latin American association, it's not just, it's the hashtag, it's the Latin HD. So the infrastructure we have, most of us are part of universities. So we use our university infrastructure in order to communicate. Some of us have biannual conferences, some of them have annual conferences, and we are trying to go to every conference we can. There is no board of directors. There's still there is the Colombian Association, and there is the Mexican one and the Argentinian one, and we are all working together somehow. Like there is no chief or director of, so each association has their own structure and governance, and then we just work together. Like the Colombian invite us to do something with them, okay, and then the Argentinians come, and so that was necessary to have a horizontal kind of project. Once you have a governance, things can get a little sketchy, because who's going to be the director? The Argentinians, why the Argentinians? The Colombians, what? So maybe each have our own associations and we work together. That's been working for us, and I think it's going to keep working for us in order not to be colonizing the Americas again.
More questions?
Yeah, right.
Mhm.
Proceed. So one question I asked myself further was about there are different forms of cultural heritage. So and there are, as you mentioned before, and I found it really interesting that you said, well, being periphery is not as such a problem. So there might be also options in. However, I asked myself, it is important to be there and to be known, because then it's clear what is important here, and then what you can say, well, that's specific with regard to us, and we want to show the world that we are these. And I asked myself, well, with regard to these overarching internet and these millions of information, the space of non-knowing is really growing and growing. And therefore, it's really difficult. It's really difficult to raise awareness and to say, well, we are here, and to show it and to make it transparent, and also in a way that others can take this information out. Because and then these forms of awareness rising are although not these the tools of the internet are really strong, they are at the same time really creating ignorance.
Yeah.
And therefore, I would be really curious about how you deal with this question. With regard to creating your network here, this specific Latin American network, but I found really interesting. But I wouldn't also.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's why the first thing we need to, I mean, it's done. The Latin American network is actually quite strong and working together. And we're also deeping, like, we have some people in the APHO, the association, like I'm part of the conference committee in the national organization, in the international organization. So there is like, you can have, change the call for papers because we need it to have in this many languages, but also we need to accept contributions in these many languages, not only in English. Weird. So it's, I mean, it's like a double agent, working with the periphery and also working within the national international organization. And it is true that most of the national international organization are it's from Europe and North America, but it's every year you have more and more not only Latin Americans but also South Africa, Taiwan just become part of the association. So it's little by little it's kind of growing, and it's been what about 10 years that the first non-European association went, and it was Japan. So it's little by little. I mean, I know Japan is not at the periphery, but it was in that context. So it's being done, and I think every year you can see I'm looking at the programs of the conferences. You have more diversity of names being participating in that conference. Then, so I think it's been working. It's not, we are not dominating the center, but we are reaching towards the center. We are part of that. So,
Anything else? Otherwise, we can start the break and have a bit longer break.
okay.
Okay, thank you, Miriam.
Thank you.
I think some people are still not here.
Okay, so we are still missing some people. Okay, so I'm gonna introduce Aline. So Aline Olteanu holds a PhD in semiotics of education from Roehampton University. Since 2015, he had several postdoctoral appointments at several universities in Europe, during which he worked mainly on multiculturalism and digital literacies. He published prolifically in semiotics and education journals. Among other publications, he is the author of the book Multiculturalism as Multimodal Communication, a Semiotic Perspective, and co-author of Semiotic Theory of Learning, New Perspectives in the Philosophy of Education. His current work at Cultures of Research in Aachen focuses on the role that imagination as a cognitive capacity and social condition has in scientific modeling and more broadly, the transformation of higher education. So welcome, Aline.
Thanks. Thanks very much. Okay.
Maybe the video too.
What?
The video.
The video too.
And
And how do I get rid of this bar?
más.
I don't. Sorry. Más. Yeah.
And then ocultar controles de reunión flotantes.
Thank you.
Very good.
Thanks, Alan. But thanks. I would like to start by saying how much I'm enjoying this workshop and our time here at UNAM. And I would like to thank, of course, first of all, Anna and Stefan. Stefan, because he is the architect of these varieties of science workshops, and Anna, because is the main organizer of this workshop, together with our colleagues at UNAM who are hosting us here and organized such a nice event. And I'm learning a lot also from discussing with our colleagues from Aarhus who are here. So yeah, thanks very much everyone for this event. I'm learning a lot. My presentation is mainly on learning. I'm concerned with the education for the third industrial revolution, which I think as a program to be designed and delivered needs a rethinking of learning as embodied and medial. I have to click. Yeah, right. So what's the third industrial revolution, or what do I mean by it? Well, this is a concept or a theory from socioeconomic theory for sustainable development by Jeremy Rifkin. Jeremy Rifkin thinks of industrial revolutions as mergings of communication technologies and corresponding resources. So from this point of view, he thinks of three industrial revolutions so far, namely one constituting the merging of steam and print, one the merging of broadcasting and oil, and now we are undergoing, according to Rifkin, a third industrial revolution consisting in the merging of digital communication networks with renewable energy grids. And this industrial revolution, like any industrial revolution, requires an appropriately trained workforce, which we do not have. And I would say we do not have, and certainly Rifkin explains that too, we do not have so designed educational program, educational philosophy. Rifkin, and I agree with him, also finds that this lack of correspondence between workforce demands, job market demands, and education is the cause for the surge in right-wing populism in recent years. Right? It explains this dissatisfaction. And my presentation today focuses on explaining or working out the educational philosophy and theory that I see needful for training adequately a workforce for this new industrial revolution, an industrial revolution that needs also to deliver sustainability. And educational philosophy and theory has been massively conservative. It's been very resistant to change. And I think we need a radical change here. For this, I think we need to rethink the notion of learning in light of which education is designed. So what I'll do today is I'll propose a notion of learning that is interpretative, and hence I'm taking a semiotic approach. It is intermedial, thus inviting a media theoretical approach. And I think in this regard, I'm taking a very similar theoretical standpoint with Miriam, who presented earlier, because then I also claim that learning, because it is intermedial, it is cross and multimodal. It is continuous in a sense that it is in a sense that process and pragmatic philosophy would think of knowledge as an ongoing continuous process. Learning is embodied, as posited by notions of embodied cognition and extended mind, for instance, and as such it is also positioned, or to use a term from cognitive linguistics, it is viewpointed, which also implies that learning is always relational in the sense that relational sociology, for instance, talks about relations. And this will further on lead me to claim that the notion of literacy as the rationale of education is misleading. And I propose the notion of learning as semiotic scaffolding, which I will unfurl. As the starting point that I take is a criticism from Andrew Stables. Andrew Stables, who was my PhD supervisor, that education, as it has been developed in Western modernity, it is terribly Aristotelian, right? It does not take into consideration that learning, and indeed being, is at all times a process of becoming, right? So Stables explains, educational theory is necessarily concerned with what it means to become human, becoming implying a process of growth and change. In general, philosophy of education has married this emphasis in a way that is basically Aristotelian, taking the view that childhood, defined as the period during which one is being educated, is preparation for a settled period as adult citizen, during which one's life and role in society is relatively stable, and during which one's human nature is given its full expression. Traditionally, then, first we become human, then we are fully human, and indeed conceptions such as childhood and human rights are derived from this premise. This premise is unsound, claims Stables, observing simply that childhood is a time of being as well as becoming, and adulthood a time of change as well as stability. Children have relatively fixed identities, while adults are relatively insecure in theirs. And thanks God it's like that, right? So this notion of human as becoming implies that the education does not have an end goal. Sorry for the typo over there. We cannot think of education as having an end goal, right? As delivering the complete adult, the complete functional citizen that can engage in social life, in civic life, because of its finite and fixed set of skills that form a literacy. This Aristotelian view in education, in modern education, goes hand in hand, I argue, with a medial effect of print that has constrained what modern education may become, right? It has inculcated a view of learning as linear and finite progress. And this medial effect of print that I'm talking about has been referred to as monomodality. And Kress and Van Leeuwen have been the first scholars to unpack this and to coin the term monomodality, as well as the very instrumental notion of multimodality some 20 years ago in a framework that they call social semiotics. They observed that for a long time now, in Western culture, there's been a distinct preference for monomodality. The most highly valued genres of writing came entirely without illustration and had graphically uniform dense pages of print. This is monomodality. Paintings nearly all use the same support, the same medium, whatever their style or object. In concert performances, all musicians dressed identically, and only conductor and soloists were allowed a modicum of bodily expression, which also is to say just how militaristic in its aesthetics, at least, modernity is, and modern education particularly. The specialized theoretical and critical disciplines which developed to speak of these arts became equally monomodal. One language to speak of language, one to speak of art, one to speak of music, and so on, each of its own methods, its own assumptions, its own technical vocabulary, its own strengths, and its own blind spots. And Kress and Van Leeuwen, writing in 2001, argued that more recently this dominance of monomodality has begun to reverse, right? And I would like to note at this point that it's also this monomodality inculcated by print that supported the Kuhnian view of science as consisting in disciplinary paradigms, right? An atomistic view of science. What has begun to reverse more precisely? When Kress and Van Leeuwen say that what has produced monomodality started to reverse, what are they particularly talking about? Well, I'll take the iPhone as an example of what I mean, or to explain better what Kress and Van Leeuwen meant back then. When he announced the iPhone in 2007, Steve Jobs claimed that it will be so successful because of its, quote, revolutionary user interface. And he was right. And I like very much how two scholars, whom some of us know, Ernst and Schroeder, unpack this from a media perspective. What was revolutionary, they comment, was principally the outstanding opportunities for using the new user interface of the iPhone. For Jobs, interface was a central selling point, and they add, but gestural control is just one side of the coin. The other is the virtualization of the user interface, which was worked out very rigorously with the iPhone. In the film from 2002, Minority Report, you might remember with, what's his name? Tom Cruise, thank you. That's the one. I wrote. Tom Cruise still wears a glove to use the interface, right, of some screen. In 2007, Apple had gone a step further. Now a human finger sufficed. Jobs insisted during his presentation that fixed physical keyboards are a mistake. I think there's so many interesting points here, right? So on the one hand, we see that what's really successful about digital technologies is their affordances for being manipulated by the human body without other instruments in between, right? We managed to design them so as to be so appropriately useful for human embodiment. And I like very much the point that fixed physical keyboards are a mistake, right? Physical, I think that we came up with keyboards because of how biased, because of our practices of producing prints have been, right? We didn't know any better. We were so used to the pen, yes, and to the print press that the best way we knew at first to interact with a screen was through a keyboard with fixed number of buttons, fixed and so on. That's monomodality. So from the revolution that digital technologies produce, it's quite obvious that literacy is obsolete. right? What's literacy? Well, literacy is the capacity to participate to society through fixed skills of manipulating alphanumeric symbols, right? And yeah, this capacity to manipulate alphanumeric symbols has been instrumental to engaging in social and civic and political life for a long time, namely during the age of print, right? But now this does not, this set of skills does not suffice. This doesn't help you with the iPhone, if I'm to be all too simplistic about it, right? So multimodality is linked with a notion of embodiment. And I explain with what, moreover, with what Jeremy Rifkin calls biosphere consciousness. So the same Kress, the multimodality guy, observes that in the reception of a sign, the materiality of modes interacts with the physiology of bodies. But I note here that here in what is embodied approach to knowledge, Kress does not stick to Cartesian notion of reason or to some analytic philosophical approach to knowledge, but a semiotic one, right? In the reception of a sign, the materiality of modes interacts with the physiology of bodies. More interestingly, on the same lines, Rifkin explains that a radical new view of human nature is emerging in the biological and cognitive sciences and creating controversy in intellectual circles, the business community and the government. Why? Because it upsets post-Cartesian notions of reason that have been part and parcel of everything that counted as education, right? The notion of literacy is a Cartesian notion. Recent discoveries in brain science and child development are forcing us to rethink the long-held belief that human beings are by nature aggressive, materialistic, utilitarian, and self-interested. The dawning realization that we are a fundamentally empathic species has profound and far-reaching consequences for society. I find it very interesting that there's a link between a view of the human as fundamentally empathic, a view of the human as continuously becoming, and a view of the human as an embodied subject that, as such, as being embodied, can only know things in a multimodal way. Monomodality has always been an illusion. Actually, the product of print, whatever it may be, the book, is. We know it multimodally through the plurality of our sense experience channels, but we abstractly think of it as monomodal because that fits the Cartesian view on knowledge. And to my contribution to this framework takes a particular semiotic approach based on Charles Peirce, the American pragmatist, the founder of modern semiotics and pragmatist philosophy, which I take to look into a framework which I take to look into educational philosophy. Now, before getting into the nitty-gritty of Peirce's philosophy, I would like to point out to this passage from Peirce's work that I find so avant-garde and deeply insightful. I think here Peirce, writing more than 100 years ago, pretty much foresaw everything that I just said until now. So he explains, one of the old Scotch psychologists mentions, which were trendy at the time, mentions a strikingly exhibiting the disparateness of different senses, that a certain man blind from birth asked of a person of normal vision whether the color scarlet was nothing like the blare of a trumpet. And the philosopher evidently expects his readers to laugh with him over the incongruity of the notion, right? So the founders of pedagogical psychology, of pedagogy in general, at that point of psychology, could not, found actually that knowledge is acquired through the senses as discrete, as separate one from the other. And of course, we know in this paradigm, the senses in general are rather misleading. And then Peirce continues to comment. But what he really illustrates, the psychologist, much more strikingly, is the dullness of apprehension of those who, like himself, had only the conventional education of the 18th century and remained wholly uncultivated in comparing the ideas that in their matter are very unlike. So 18th century education, the claim is here, is conservative, is rigid, is dull, kills creativity. And it misses what, from a contemporary perspective, is called multimodality. So from Peirce's, putting Peirce in contemporary concepts, he thought of conceptualization as intermedial, as cross-modal, right? He's talking about multimodality. And also what we get from this as well is the importance of empathy in education, right? If the psychologists would so much as pay attention to the blind person articulation of a sign here that combines different modalities, if they would as much as pay attention, they might get something out of it, but they are dismissive. That's the problem. That's also one of the problems of this 18th century conventional education. And Peirce had actually a name for a doctrine of empathy. He called it agapism, from one of the Greek words for that is roughly translated as love, agapi. For him, agapism is the doctrine that evolution, in any kind of evolution, proceeds through chance, through necessity, so Lamarckianism, Darwinism, but also through love, through agape, through self-sacrificial love, which is a strong metaphysical claim. I agree. And so the recent multimodality framework in social semiotics proposes a switch from what has been for such a long time called grammar, which is fixed, to thinking of language and of learning as constituted through semiotic resources. That is, resources for meaning making. When we think, when we articulate, when we express, we do not simply fall on a fixed grammar, if you want, on a keyboard, which has also a finite rule for combinatorics, right, like syntax, but on semiotic resources that are loose, that are, so to say, up for grabs, and that afford creativity. So here's Kress explaining. Grammar is about rules, conventions, certainty, phenomena that are fixed, settled. When business leaders, politicians, media pundits bemoan that the young leave school and are unemployable because they cannot write a proper sentence, so they lack literacy, they look back some 30 or 40 years and seem to discern through a sepia-tinged haze, through nostalgia, that in their day, the teaching of grammar had produced just such ideal conditions, right? They know that the young do not use the rules, which they are certain that they had followed way back then, and which they think they use still in the present practice, right? They impose their conservatism because they think of success, of financial success, of economic success, of professional success as based on this fixed set of rules. Adherence to linguistic convention, Kress continues, is equated with adherence to social convention and consequently with social stability. Alas, and this is our great opportunity, as the third industrial revolution is unfolding. Alas, says Kress, the present day is deeply unstable. Might be a scary thought, but it's a good thing because we need to snap out of this grammarous knowledge notion. The present is deeply unstable. No amount of nostalgia can change that. The need is for a labor force, so the same as Kress, so it's the same argument as Rifkin. The need is for a labor force that can meet the semiotic demand of conditions now. In this, grammar, in its older sense of a stable system of rules, is an obstacle to necessary action. So literacy cannot be based on this old notion of grammar. And the problem runs very deep. So we need to develop a notion of literacy not only as corresponding to print, but to mediality in general. And as such, we need a notion of critical media literacy through which should run in education. One of my favorite scholars on the matter, Dana Boyd, whom you see in the photo, explains this, that even though media literacy programs have been discussed and haphazardly implemented for decades, most people have little training in being critical of the content that they consume. Right? Simply using the iPhone doesn't make me a critical thinker, put it simply. Long before the internet, critical media literacy has never been considered essential in schools or communities, right? For instance, as we switched from a print-based society to, say, a broadcasting, radio and TV-based society, we did not update education. You know, this is why Nazism was possible because of radio. This is why, you know, genocides were possible because of the TV, right? Censorship of inaccurate, and of course, censorship is never a solution. Censorship of inaccurate or problematic content does not provide youth the skills they will one day need to evaluate information independently. So I'm coming back to Stables now, from whom I started, right? The notion of learning as becoming, the notion of being as becoming. He explains that the move from reason, from the more notion of reason to a more contemporary adequate viewing on education as semiotic, as semiosic, you know, the move from reason to semiosis, implies a move from literacy to a term he makes up, semiosis. So, you know, a capacity that is a capacity, a social capacity that does not rely on skills to manipulate alphanumeric symbols, but any types of media and modalities. Right? Literacy is fixed, bound to one science system alone, one science system alone. It is monotechnological. Semiosis, you know, coming from the term semiosis or interpretation, is multimodal, is polysemiotic, is open, it's never complete, it always involves becoming, and it is multi-technological. So here's Stables explaining that everyone is and becomes semiate, while not everyone becomes literate. There are grounds for stating that person A is more literate than person B, but not that she is more semiate. To regard A as more learned would be to employ a restricted definition of learning as equating to traditional scholarly activity. Each person is differently semiate, however, and patterns of response to life events generally are what determine different levels of success and well-being. Some people are better than others at increasing material resource. Some are more content with their lot. The point is, we can't think of education in terms of prefixed outcomes, right? We don't know what is best for the individual, right? The notion of literacy is discriminating. It thinks of success and well-being in a monomodal way, right? So the point here is that a notion of semiosis will lead to a more open educational system. And now I'm going to unpack the notion, that rigid notion of grammar and monomodality a bit further. You know, it's all of modern linguistics is dominated by that idea, right? Because as, for instance, most clearly seen in Ferdinand de Saussure, approximately a century ago, linguistics has defined meaning as more often than not a strictly linguistic, right? And as a arbitrary articulation of two opposing entities, such as a concept or a sound image, a sensible and the perceptible, as Saussure called them, a signifier and a signified, right? And the sign is fixed and functional because of the arbitrariness of this connection, right? The signifier and the signified must not have any accidental similarity, because the argument here is, if they would suggest each other somehow, if, say, the word dog would suggest the animal that this word stands for, then language will not function as a social convention, because it will always be subject to the accident of individual interpretation. So, and for this reason, in this paradigm, there's a strict distinction between language and speech, collective and individual. This is this theory is the precursor of double articulation, which is the foundation of all phonology, and of the vast literature scholarship of cultural criticism scholarship that is founded on the notion of text. That is all that wide scholarship that analyzes any cultural artifact or any cultural habit through the prism of language. And this is exactly the target of the criticism of multimodality of Kress and Van Leeuwen. And this runs deep indeed. And it's typical of European Enlightenment. This is actually the foundation of European Enlightenment as I see it. I'm not one to criticize European Enlightenment through and through. I think that, you know, European Enlightenment produced an increase of well-being that is unprecedented, really. It also justified colonialism, imperialism, right? And it also inculcated this strict notion of grammar, which is the foundation of education and indeed academia, right? So you can see on the slide my translation of the Article 24 from the foundational document of the French Academy, the Académie Française, which is still in use unaltered today by the French Academy since 1635. So as I translated this, the primary function of the Academy would be to work carefully and diligently on establishing specific rules to our language. Also note the first person singular, right? Identification, our language, rendering it pure, eloquent, and capable of expressing arts and sciences, right? I think that it doesn't need much explanation. It embodies everything that I was criticizing earlier. And from this conception, in light of this conception, particularly modern philosophy and modern education indeed has confused learning with language acquisition. We see this, you know, from the early days of Enlightenment in contractualist philosophy, the likes of Locke, Rousseau, and so on, to German Romanticism in Humboldt and let alone Herder, up to modern pedagogists, Piaget and Vygotsky, right? A confusion of learning with language acquisition. And the confusion runs deeper because language acquisition, of course, is also paralleled with acculturation. So in German, most clearly in German Romanticism, learning becomes acculturation, education. The role of education is acculturation, not so much developing creativity in a sense of criticism, but being acculturated. And as Underhill explains in the case of Humboldt, even more clear, even more specifically than acculturation, I'm citing over here the ongoing adventure of a nature's cultivation, right? Citing from Underhill, Humboldt situates culture at the center of a society's, or rather nation's, development. And when he considers culture to be the cultivation of the mind through language and thought. And also in this view, in the Humboldtian view, language is the organ of thought. We think in language, which means that if we speak different languages, we think entirely differently, right? This, and I argue this is a consequence of monomodality, which is a concept which was inculcated of print literacy, or what Benedict Anderson called print capitalism, that which entailed nationalism historically. In case you might be tempted to think that I'm fighting windmills over here because I'm fighting Humboldt and the French Academy from the 17th century. Well, this happens to this day, right? This is Maurice Druon, who was president, or what, I don't remember what you call the big daddy in French Academy, I think president of the French Academy in 1995. I apologize, I didn't translate this from French, but the point is very simple. This was an introductory note to a new edition of the Statut Règlement, the foundational document of the French Academy, which I cited earlier, that Maurice Druon wrote in 95. So the constitution, that constitutional document was unchanged. This introduction was added, which simply justifies it. Right? He explains that it is not useless to impose again that very strict notion of language. This is what this is about here. And that was 1995. he's justifying why it is useful to make a new edition of the Statut Règlement, which is unchanged, which is absurd already. Why are you even producing a new edition? And of course, the French Academy is at great odds with recognizing linguistic variation and diversity, right? Starting with 2008, there's been an attempt in the French National Assembly to vote for recognizing constitutionally regional languages. There are many regional languages within the European French heartland and in colonial territories. And this eventually happened, but the French Academy strongly opposed it. The French Academy vocally and strongly opposed it, right? According to the French Academy, the French constitution must acknowledge only one language and only one variety of French, right? And of course, this is academically, theoretically, absolutely flawed, right? Monolingualism has been an illusion. We've been thinking of language as we've been thinking of the linguistic phenomenon as atomistic, and of the cultural phenomenon as well as monolingual. We've been thinking of language as something monolingual because of the illusion that print literacy inculcated, right? I'm citing here the work of Lachtenmaki, a scholar in applied linguistics that I particularly enjoy, but this is common sense right now in linguistics, that, as Lachtenmaki explains, while all societies are factually multilingual, they may see themselves as monolingual. Such societies are dominated by the ideology of monolingualism and monoculturalism, which is reflected most explicitly in the language policy of a particular society. The ideology of monolingualism assumes that the unity of a linguistic community is based on the existence of a unified language shared by the members of the community. And monoculturalism, or what also called culturalism, then further posits that this community identified as such must also be governed singularly, right? A government needs to correspond to a cultural community, which is a linguistic community, because the supposition of culturalism is, and it's completely flawed, of course, there's a correspondence between culture and politics, there's a correspondence between culture and human rights. Human rights are subject to culture from this point of view, right? And indeed, for instance, very early on, McLuhan posited print created individualism and nationalism in the 16th century, right? By the time when the French Academy was formed, pretty much a bit earlier, when print became the dominating technology. And this is what Anderson explained, Benedict Anderson, as print capitalism, and Edward Said's comments on literacy, particularly in the Middle East, point to the same, in my opinion. So, moving on to my proposal now. Building on the Persian perspective that I briefly presented earlier, I take on what's called a biosemiotic line of thinking to tackle glottocentrism, namely language centrism, and this rigid notion of literacy. Why? Well, I think very appreciated scholar at the moment, Paul Cobley, explains very well how all cultural criticism has been dominated by glottocentrism, by language centrism, right? In post-structuralism, the notion of textuality has been the main tool for analyzing language, starting, say, with Lodman and Barth. And the same happened pretty much in analytic philosophy, starting with the linguistic turn, as Richard Rorty pretty much called it, right? The shift from basically both structural semiotics and analytic philosophy marked the move away from Cartesian reason to thinking knowledge as based on language, as knowledge constituted in language. And the move away from Cartesianism is welcome, but then they fell in this in language centrism. And Cobley explains the idea that knowledge is constructed in discourse, with humans' apprehension of the world amounting to a mere figment induced by figures in language, arose out of the linguistic turn and post-structuralism. The nominalism of the linguistic turn is at odds with the Persian realist perspective in biosemiotics. It also posits a definition of language based on figures of speech and chatter, rather than what I will unpack now, the more sophisticated cognitive perspective in biosemiotics offered by language as modeling. Now, I shall take a look at Peirce only briefly to point out what's the crux of the matter here that allows for an anti-language perspective, anti-language centric perspective. So Peirce pretty much thought of learning as interpreting, or interpreting as learning, right? Interpretation is the action of science, and one way in which Peirce defines the sign is by saying that a sign is something by knowing which we know something more. Beautiful, if you ask me. All thought and knowledge is by science. A sign is an object which is in a relation to its object on the one hand, and to an interpretant, that is a conclusion on the other, in such a way as to bring the interpretant into a relation to the object corresponding to its own relation to the object. The first element of the sign, Peirce usually calls it representamen, and this this concept of the sign can be represented graphically as the tripod that you see on the slide. And of course, he thinks of interpretation as a process, right? As a never-ending, continuously unfolding process. He used the word semiosis for it. And by semiosis, he explains, I mean, an action or influence which is or involves a cooperation of three subjects, a sign or representamen, its object and its interpretant, this tri-relative influence not being in any way resolvable into actions between pairs. The irreducibility of this triadic graph is important because it posits that interpretation is a complex form of causation. And Peirce's work was acknowledged as instrumental in what very recently was called the iconic turn. The iconic turn, which pretty much reverses the linguistic turn. This started in studies on visuality. It started there, but it was pretty much infused by now in all of the humanities. And Boehm and Mitchell have been pretty much the first visual art scholars to observe the iconic turn unfolding. And in their correspondence, I point out here how they unpack it pretty much, to how they observe it. So here's Boehm saying, for instance, that understanding the image as logos, right, not reason, but and not concept, but image. Understanding the image as logos as a meaning-generating process. This vision of a non-verbal iconic logos was in short my motivation for ascribing paradigmatic meaning to the growing interest in the image, and for speaking of the iconic turn as a project with a longer perspective. And also Mitchell in agreement, is there not a mathematics of the image? Mathematics is not only alphanumeric symbolical. Is there not a mathematics of the image that links it to questions of form, symmetry, and quantification of intensities? Doesn't the emergence of new forms of the digital image produce a new relation of iconicity and numeracy in our time? And isn't the mathematics of the image, in fact, as old as measurement, perspectival representation, and notions of formal resemblance, congruence, and repetition in ornament? And of course, the question is rhetorical. It is so old, but we've been missing it out because of our monomodal paradigm of print, right? And I would like to point out to the genealogy of the iconicity concept here, right? It starts with Peirce. Peirce claimed the term iconicity, and the icon is one of the types of signs that Peirce sees as forming our experience. It's a sign type that signifies due to similarity, and this is one of the the importance that Peirce gave to iconicity, knowing in general, was one of the reasons for which Peirce was both rejected and misinterpreted for a long time. The first scholar to really point out to the importance of iconicity via Peirce was Roman Jakobson, and then much later arguably Terence Deacon, particularly in the concept of evolution. And but this became really big recently in semiotics, and not only for the work of Friedrich Sternfeld, whom many of you know, and I would also add Lars Ellerstrom. And I like very much how Steve Fuller, whom many of you also know, gives a particular importance to Peirce in evolution theory, right? For evolution theory. So he explains that what has been called evolutionist refers to this type of thinkers that observed continuity throughout evolution, right? The family of thinkers in the modern era called evolutionists, Fuller explains, who differ considerably among them over the means and ends of such evolution, have nevertheless shared a continuous turn of mind that tends to reduce differences of kind to differences of degree. Here I point back to the notion of being as becoming. And Fuller continues, I credit this insight to Charles Peirce, whose own thinking had been energized by Duns Scotus in opposition to Aquinas. That goes into a longer debate into which we don't need to jump, but it is very interesting how Fuller observes this importance of Charles Peirce for evolution theory, for construing being as becoming, as some other Peirce scholars, Andacht and Michel, observed, right? Andacht and Michel comment that from a Peircean perspective, I quote, the self is construed as a sign in continuous growth. So like in Stables, through a reflexive interpretive dialogue that aims to integrate multiple particular identities, not a singular identity, into a unity of a generative process. And this points out to a co-evolution paradigm in evolution theory, right? That blurs the boundaries between, sorry, I didn't mean evolution, I meant here that the boundaries between adaptation and learning are blurred through this co-evolution perspective, right? Where genotype and phenotype are not seen as opposing poles, right? And I argue that in Peirce, there is a latent media process and technology philosophy, as well as an extended mind theory, right? Well, in all these regards, I think Peirce was very avant-garde, and we have much to learn from this. For instance, he claimed language resides in the tongue, right? That's Peirce. Language resides in the tongue. This would scandalize all Saussurean linguists, many linguists still today that think of language as something mental and something collective, and opposed to speech as the accident of the individual. Peirce wrote, language resides in the tongue. It is much more true that the thoughts of a living writer are in any printed copy of her book than they are in her brain, that is in the extension, right? Or even more so, right here. So this is Peirce scandalizing linguists. Now, scandalizing the psychologists of his time, and indeed many contemporary linguists, psycholinguists, sorry. A psychologist cuts out a lobe of my brain, says Peirce. And then when I find I cannot express myself, he says, you see, your faculty of language was localized in the lobe. Yeah, sure, Peirce says. No doubt it was. And so if he had flinched my inkstand, I should not have been able to continue my discussion until I had got another. Yea, the very thoughts would not come to me. So my faculty of discussion is equally localized in my inkstand, right? And indeed, the horror we live when we lose our phones, our smartphones, we're lost, right? This is what he's saying. So this is, I think, an avant-garde way of what, McLuhan found it as media theory, what Lakoff and Johnson called embodied cognition, and what Clark and Chalmers called the extended mind. And of course, as we've seen, Peirce had this processual and continuous view of the self as becoming. He explains, which goes hand in hand with the extended mind theory, right? Every reasoning involves another reasoning, which in its turn involves another, and so on ad infinitum. The past is the ego. My recent past is my uppermost ego. My distant past is my more generalized ego. The past of the community is our ego. In attributing a flow of time to unknown events, we impute a quasi-ego to the universe. The present is the immediate representation we are just learning that brings the future or non-ego to be assimilated into the ego. And of course, this has been an important influence in Whitehead's process philosophy, which we see more recently discussed by recent contemporary Peirce scholars. Further, Fuller also observes an important relation between media theory and pragmatism, right? So part and parcel with the evolution theory involved, right? Fuller observes that, say, once in America, Kapp, the father of philosophy of technology, was captivated by Emerson's characterization of the telegraph as an extension of the human senses, an image that McLuhan popularized in the 60s to cover all media. What Fuller was not interested to comment on here was that Emerson was a very important influence in Peirce, and that, you know, while Peirce coined the term pragmatism and then William James popularized it, Emerson is also thought of as a pragmatist philosopher, and Peirce certainly saw him like that, right? And it's this idea of the extension of the senses that ushers what Fuller and others call the mind technology thesis. The mind technology thesis as opposed to the mind-body problem, right? What might be called a strong mind technology thesis is that the philosophy of mind and the philosophy of technology are two ways of talking about the same thing, whereby technology is understood to mean the mind's outworking in nature. And I like this definition from Fuller. Technology is the mind's outworking in nature. And this leads to a view of the human as future, not mainly past, or at least both future and past oriented view, right? The human is becoming. And Fuller particularly explains the human is not or cannot be defined only in light of as the, whatever comes out of the bipedal ape. This was, according to Fuller, Carl Linnaeus's idea, right? That whatever comes out of the bipedal ape is human. But this is actually very constricting, very restrictive. The human is also what a human may become, right? We are not defined only by the ape that was, but that the cyborg that we may become, right? So as such, I find here a way to Peirce's pragmatism to overcome substance metaphysics through this view of being as becoming that we've seen in Stables, in recent Peirce scholars such as Colapetro and Andacht and Michel and others. And particularly instrumental here on this view, in biosemiotics, a notion of semiotic causation has been defined as final causation that is open-ended. And it's we can think of semiotic causation as the acquisition of habits. I know I mentioned, and I don't go in any details, my colleagues know the pain here, my pain here. There's one important aspect in regard to which I disagree with Steve Fuller's transhumanism, and that is his advocacy of morphological freedom. I just want to posit that. I'm not getting into any details. How am I doing with time, Anna?
Well, you're now around 30 minutes for questions.
Ooh, really? I've been talking for an hour.
More or less.
Yeah, I'm bad. You know what? I'll wrap it up then. Because here I am, right? So my point is that unearthing this, so I need to find my right slide, this Peircean view of learning as interpreting allows for, here we are, no, sorry, forgive me, allows for developing an educational philosophy and system as based on semiosis, or a notion of literacy that, here we go, that does not suppose glottocentrism anymore and detaches us from the loopholes of modern dualism. The point is that in modern philosophy, so I'm looking here at two other prominent Peirce scholars, Petrilli and Pontio, who explain that from this modern philosophical disembodied view of knowledge, and now I cite, the body is understood and experienced as an isolated biological entity, as belonging to the individual. And this has led to the quasi-total extinction of cultural practices and worldviews that are based on intercorporeity, interdependency, exposition, and opening of the body. What we are left with are mummified residues studied by folklore analysts, archaeological remains preserved in ethnological museums and in national literatures, these being expressions of a generalized museumification, which I like, right? We think of cultures as isolated monoblocks, or at least isolatable monoblocks, which can be archived in finite collections, right? That actually are then confused with those supposedly cultural monoblocks, right? This is a consequence of print and of Cartesianism, of mind-body dualism, right? And to wrap up, therefore, I hope that I pretty much managed to suggest to some extent that the notions of multimodality and embodiment are mutual and both mutually implicit, and they are both necessary in for thinking education from the perspective of digital literacies, or more comprehensively semiosis, and that the view of human as becoming and of mind as extension or extending is compatible with the view of human as empathic, which Rifkin sees as necessary for the third industrial revolution, right? As he argues that to be truly human is to be universally empathic and therefore more appropriately, morally appropriate in one's embodied experience, right? And this is, and Rifkin sees in this that this is one of the claims of recent philosophy of embodiment. And I end on this note. Thank you.
So we have around 20 minutes for questions.
Thank you.
Scientific knowledge, because sometimes I feel discovering things with knowledge that are not great. For example, for people who work with reality, like artists, sculptors.
Specifically, sorry?
It's a fact that, as Varela said, mind is not in the head. This embodying cognition, it's kind of obvious for people like
right. Yes. Yeah.
I don't know. I think it's evidence of the variety of knowledge but that's not my question. You were talking about education, and I want to ask examples of the application of these proposed practical examples.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks. I mean, with your first comment, in general, I agree. Yeah, we see things, I guess, in the same way over there. There would be a lot to say. Maybe we'll get a chance to talk more later. Practical examples. I think that the well, we need to cultivate creativity and critical thinking through means and modalities other than text, right? And as you said, for artists, for many artists that work with matter, it's quite obvious. But as much as we have been fascinated with art as embodied by cultures, embodied by material artistic artifacts, material artifacts for such a long time. I think the work of the artist, the manual work of the artist, so to say, did not penetrate the educational paradigm in any kind of way, right? And you see, modern education would think of critical thinking as strictly linguistic and in its best incarnation written, right? Handbooks do not have embellishments. And if they have any expression other than black on white typography, right, more than just text typography, well, it is considered an ornamentation, an embellishment. It is considered something aside critical thinking, something aside unessential, and aside what is being delivered to students. And I use the word delivered purposefully here because, you know, this also goes hand in hand with an information theory model of learning, where learning, the educational process is a process of delivering prefixed information, right? Pretty much unidirectionally from someone who is a teacher to some who are students. I'm sorry, I still am not giving you very concrete examples, but I think that I'm giving some suggestions of what the examples might be. So I think it is difficult to give examples also because I don't for examples for concrete examples to narrow down the scope of this theoretical approach, right? And one other important point that I'm making here is empathy in education, right? If we you know, the recent call for an ethics of care, particularly in education, is underpinned, I guess, by the multimodality criticism of monomodality, right? Because it also collapses this unidirectional information theory model of learning, right? Learning is not what the teacher is delivering to students. Learning is a dialogue, right? I'm saying something rather simple here, but the educational theory has overlooked this. And sure, sometimes we find advocacy for these matters in educational philosophy and theory, but they don't make it to the classroom in actual practice. I hope I'm managing to answer somewhat satisfactorily. I really would like to talk more later.
Yeah, thank you for a very rich presentation.
Thank you.
I want to ask a little bit about the third industrial revolution.
Yes.
Because it's clear that the parts of the representation involve learning and education is very involved and informed and as well specified. I was a little concerned about this concept about the third industrial revolution and who we are.
Please forgive me. I'm sorry, may I ask you to speak a little bit louder because I
Sure.
can't really say.
I mean, who are we allowing to write our history, and who are we allowing to write our present conditions? And I feel a little bit, you know, concerned to entrust that job to Jeremy Rick.
Right.
I mean, he's a highly controversial historian who's received lots of critique for lack of scientific rigor and, you know, put up strawmen and so on and so forth. I mean, for me, it would be a little bit the same as entrusting Klaus Schwab in World Economic Forum.
I'm not familiar with this person.
No, but he has been one of diagnosing the fourth industrial revolution.
Right.
The reason why I think it's problematic to the people like Rick and Schwab, you know, write our history and diagnose our present is because, for instance, Rick, he has a consulting company.
Yeah.
Solutions.
Yes.
To guide us this year through the third industrial revolution.
Right. Yeah.
Likewise, Klaus Schwab, who is diagnosed in the fourth industrial revolution, has his World Economic Forum to guide us through the fourth industrial revolution.
Yeah.
And I find that a little bit, I mean, problematic for you know, when you're doing science.
Right.
You know, to trust these kind of people to write history. Yes, that's it.
Thank you. What can I say? That's a very important critical point indeed. And as you coming down to, as you very well put it, who do we allow to write our history, or histories rather even, right? Because this is also such a big claim, global claim over here, right, about industrial revolutions. I think that, I mean, just to explain my position, I think that I am obviously less skeptical about Rifkin's theory than you are, and it's a matter of us discussing that theory. I see, I agree with the importance of your question. I agree that there are loopholes in Rifkin's theory, no doubt. I think that actually I feel so at ease in a context like this to refer to Rifkin's third industrial revolution as a shortcut, because what I really see valuable over there is the importance of using the idea of merging digital technology with renewable resources grids to foster sustainability, that this needs training of the workforce, which needs to be done through an institutionalization of education of sorts, and that our current education does not keep up the pace. We completely fails at doing that, and that empathy and expanding empathy is a very important part of that, of developing this new educational system. And I would take these 3 points that, would you be okay if I take these 3 points out of Rifkin and use strictly that without taking his historical theory as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just asking you back, I guess, if you're not more comfortable with kind of, you talk about these statements like,
What kind of?
the age of reason is being eclipsed by the age of empathy. I mean, this is a very fantastic kind of statement. You know, you had it in your presentation. So I'm just wondering if you're not, because I'm feeling a little bit, uncomfortable with this kind of populist statement like
Right.
This announced a new world.
Right. But I would agree with you that I'm not a fan of the rhetoric either, right? But
it's still the basis of your argument, or like suggestion to
namely my argument being that I'm certainly not pointing my fingers at particularly Descartes, the person, or this or that other modern philosopher, but the modern post-Cartesian notion of reason has led, I think, and this is probably my theory of intellectual history, has led us particularly clearly observable in education to toxic academia, if you want, all the way, right? And then there would be, I have a big task at hand to unearth all that history, but that's it, which would take time, but that's my point over there.
Sure, I think it was a stark contrast, like this red and then to your very rich, like theories, learning, education, it's very well known, risking was standing a little bit alone,
Right.
wider of like history.
Right. It doesn't just, but thank you very much. I appreciate this very much. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for this talk. I think I finally understood first better, or at least the significance of this, and I very much appreciate your theory of education.
Thank you.
And I would agree that you probably don't need with it.
Okay.
And I would add one more thing, that also I think that the way you bash print culture, that way, I would think that you can use a more complex understanding of culture. So I think for example, I yesterday I had this slide on PS, so things like it's a very interesting kind of critique of print culture, because he said print culture is more than just decoding monolithic the symbol or the symbolic decoding, but also, for example, letterheads.
Yeah.
Culture can also enforce like corporate power or things like that. So there's a complexity of print. I would say that you don't need necessarily need to like sweep under the rug, but that might even help to make your point more home, or thinking of Peter's theory of reading. Where he understands romanticism, reading something that is also intermediate translation. So translating from text to inner pictures and these kinds of things. So I think that a richer understanding of print would definitely wouldn't hurt your argument, and actually might even enrich it. So I think maybe like this opposition would be like multimodal and monomodal might not have the distinction you want to use to make your argument. So I think that's I guess that's more or less my comment, maybe the novel literacy to have, to contextualize it better. I took by your point that print has dominated culture for for hundreds of years, and that is, that has changed only recently. And that needs to be, accounted for, but maybe not to like give it too static image of what print culture signifies.
Okay. Yeah, thanks very much for this. Thanks. I agree overall. I think, it's probably because I address a certain academic public that I still stick to the multimodality, monomodality distinction. I find it useful, but I agree with everything else you said. I don't want to give the impression that I just want to throw print altogether under the rug, right? I think that hand in hand with the modern notion of reason, print as the technology dominating that paradigm has inculcated, has made us think in monomodal ways, right? And to assume monomodality uncritically and as default. And yeah, I think print is very useful. As sometimes, abstracting away, isolating modalities may be a very creative, insightful practice, right? In art, for instance, and not only in the classroom too, for that matter, in academia. But yeah, we must not confuse learning with language acquisition, and we should think of what print gives us as not a fixed grammar, but a pool of semiotic resource, a pool of resources for meaning making, and unrestricted pool of resources for meaning making that we can use and combine creatively. So my main enemy is that fixed notion of grammar that print has going hand in hand with the post-Cartesian notion of reason and so on has inculcated, not print alone as such. I hope I'm answering.
I was just thinking that maybe print is the wrong end, more like the anthropological theory behind certain epochs of print.
Indeed.
Are more relevant maybe to look at.
Indeed.
Well, that fits really perfectly. So because thanks first. It was really a good point with regard to our workshop, to have your presentation now, because I've thought a lot about these questions of where the restrictions, where boundaries, where selections come in. So we had this morning this question oppositioning global north and south via these digital infrastructures, and we had it yesterday also in different talks. This question, and I asked myself, well, what are here the selection things and the selection impacts? So print, in your understanding, is offering one selection thing. Focusing then on grammar and language acquisition, and restricting the pool of meaning making with regard to other modalities, for example. But I would also really agree on this point that perhaps it's more about a specific paradigm from where we look, and then to ask ourselves what are the selection processes going on. So then, if you turn the look from polysemiotic, then I would say, if this is, so to say, the central perspective, then we can say, well, the other forms you claim, the question of mono or multimodality, or this open or closed technological sphere, then these are then questions we have to look at, because these creating selective filters.
Yes.
Against or this polysemiotic situation which the child always has. Because there are tons of science in the environment, and they need do something meaningful out of it. No? And I can say, well, for example, with this language acquisition, yeah, I would say, yeah, for sure, it's important for building up nation states. And as we know, and as children and also as elder people, how difficult it is really to acquire languages.
Yeah.
It's really, this learning is really, really tough. And therefore, this emphasis is not that, I would say, not that surprising, because it's really a tough process also for child, but all the other too. And with regard to this, here, I would say there are specific institutionalization processes which are limiting
Yes.
these polysemiotic situations, especially in schools, where you are really fixed on specific programs and you really select out specific options for creating such a polysemiotic landscape, which is then inspiration for the ones teaching and the ones learning. I would say it would be good to have these concrete examples how these selection processes work, institutionalization processes go on, because they order them and make an emphasis on specific modalities, on specific semiotics, and so on. So that would be a good thing to look at.
I entirely agree. Thank you. I find this a very valuable comment. Thanks. I wouldn't have much to add other than, yeah, in the couple of finite products that I mean to produce out of these, a couple of papers that I have in my writing. Yeah, I'll certainly take this into consideration, particularly the term selection. I'll mention something that I didn't go through yet, is that part and parcel of the framework that I'm building here is the notion of affordance, right? That I think links with what you were saying. Yeah,
Finally would be.
yeah. But yeah, I have nothing to respond to this other than, yeah, really a very valuable point to the theory that I'm trying to build. Indeed, yes.
So last question, Josepha?
Yes, I have a couple of questions. First, thank you so much for your talk.
Thank you.
It was very interesting. My questions are the following. The first, it has to do with the notion of education that involves learning and e-learning.
Okay.
So in that sense, I would like to know what do you think about the importance of digital media for e-learning? Because in this time, we need constantly to review our thinking about the world. That's the first question. The second question has to do with how to deal with over information in this time, because I think this is a point that we need to develop new skills in people in order to select accurate information.
Okay, thanks very much. First, yeah, thank you very much for the question. So I'll point out to yet another aspect that I didn't mention, that is part and parcel of Andrew Stable's theory of being human as becoming, which is pretty much what you said. He observes, I find this particular quote insightful. What does it mean that learning is interpretative? Well, this is what it means. And he says it's an important truth little acknowledged. Namely, it is an important truth little acknowledged in educational theory that which makes knowledge and understanding possible, namely our interpretive frameworks, including our assumptions and prejudices, is also that which limits them, right? This is what it means that knowing is learning is interpretative, right? I'm not just learning is not accumulating quantitatively more information, but restructuring information, right? And that's my claim there, from which I think I hope links with everything else. Now, and yeah, over information. Well, then over information, I would also tackle in this same way, right? From this same viewpoint, right? standpoint. And I think, yeah, yet another concept that I didn't explain that I think goes into the direction of your question, the direction that your question is pointing to is that of scaffolding. Well, yeah, thank you. So I'm understanding you well, because I think, the Vygotskian notion of the zone of proximal development that then inspired the Bruner's notion of scaffolding and the role of the teacher to scaffold the knowledge, the learning of the student, that is to support it, to provide scaffolds. It has been useful for education, but still subject, part and parcel of that framework, educational theory that is the target of my criticism still. So I find here inspiration in, surprise, surprise, the notion of scaffolding a semiotic, a notion of semiotic scaffolding, where, which is a form of causation, and semiotic scaffolding or semiotic causation, Hofmeier defines it as bringing about effects through interpretation. I'm citing now from Hofmeier, as for one example, bacterial movements are caused through a process of interpretation based on historically defined needs of a sensitive system. And I know there's a lot to unpack here. Just to say, this is the biosemiotic extrapolation of the constructivist notion of scaffolding. And I think that, it leads to claim stuff like, now citing this other scholar, Kalevi-Kul, big in biosemiotics, scaffolding is the means that supports decision-making and learning. It is that which, in the situation of indeterminacy, provides certain preferences in making decisions. Also, under scaffolding, we mean the kind of structures that carry traces of some earlier like that has been built by life, by semiosis, by interpretation. So the whole point here is, well, I'm not sure where I'll stand to practically on how education should deal with over-information, but certainly the point is that at all levels of education, in educational policy, in the classroom, there must be a very clear awareness of the fact that knowledge doesn't come out of nowhere, and that whatever information whatever over-information students are exposed to, what they will get is something that fits with their existing scaffoldings somehow, right? Or changes, restructures these scaffoldings. So there is a dialectics of sorts over here that, information itself needs to be thought of as I guess, collections of semiotic resources. And I guess the whole point is that whatever information may be, it's not raw data, right? It's something already semiotically modeled, right? So the educational system must here. I think I'm building up to my argument for empathy, because what the educational system needs to take into account is really the subjective agency of each learner. I think that's the main point. That in how I think of today as being violently exposed to such abundant information. Thanks.
Okay, so thank you, Ali.
Thanks.
And talking about embodiment.
Yes. And materialities. Thank you. Thanks.